I told a young lady, you let your teachers see that you are reading India Portrait and you'll get an A grade on your next history assignment. Just because you're reading Patrick French. It's my pleasure. I think I've known Patrick French since the time of the Naipaul book, which is when, I first, and then of course I began to read backwards and I read his wonderful biography on Sir Francis' young husband. And I thought we'd start, Patrick, with the simple question. What drew you to history and to a PhD in Southeast Asian history? Yeah. Oh, South Asia.
Yeah. Well, let me first of all say how delighted I am to be in Ooty at the Literary Festival. I've always had a soft spot for hill stations. I remember my first visit to India as a teenage student, going to McLeod-Ganj, then going to Darjeeling, going to places like Nuwara in Sri Lanka, but I've never been to Ooty until yesterday. So although I was a little startled by the change in climate from Delhi, and caught a cold on the journey as we climbed higher and higher, for which my voice might give out, but I'm very, very pleased to be invited. And also, Jerry, you ask about history, but I mean, what a historic building, what a beautiful architectural example this is. And the extraordinary fact on the podium, the way that it says, established in 1859, which immediately makes me think, well, you've got the Great Rebellion of 1857, you've then got Queen Victoria's Proclamation of 1858, which I would argue is the sort of foundations of what we now see as Indian secularism, the idea that discrimination based on religion was going to be outlawed. I mean, a proclamation that in various forms found its way into the Indian constitution in 47, 48, 49. So there's a real historical sweep, actually, where we are now. So before I answer the question directly, I also think that I was very moved by the things that Shanta Gokhale said during her talk, as I'm sure everybody was. The only thought I did have, without wishing to minimize the seriousness of any of the points that she made, is that the liberal tradition in India, if you like, goes back at least 200 years. There are arguments for saying it goes back into antiquity, but it certainly goes back, I think, to the 1820s and the 1830s, the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the various liberal and nationalist movements that were stirring in places like Latin America and in parts of Europe. You look at what people, particularly in Bengal, were doing. Look at what Ram Mohan Roy was doing. Look at what Henry de Rosier was writing. You can see the stirrings of the idea that India is a country where people are free to say what they want, to think how they want. Now, of course, there were always subsequent restrictions on that, but I think there is an underlying ethos that people are free to speak. I know, having spent time in countries where people are under much more severe forms of oppression. I'm thinking of Eastern Europe in the early 1980s. I'm thinking of Tibet in the 1990s. I'm thinking of Egypt about 10 years ago. What was extraordinary in those places is that when you wanted to have conversations with people about what they thought about the society, about politics, they were physically afraid to speak. And I think people in India may self-censor when they speak in public, but really nobody in private conversation is embarrassed to say exactly what they think. So I think the liberal roots within India run very, very deep. So that's the reason for, if you like, my comparative optimism. But as to what drew me personally to history, it's funny, as a student at school, I was quite bored by history. We learned about things like the enclosures and the Corn Laws. It was very, not just Eurocentric, but Anglocentric, and it was of little interest to me. And it was really, what we would now call world history or global history, and to an extent imperial history that interested me. But the real spark, the real moment when I thought, oh my God, I could write a book, or I could study this, or I could read this, or, the moment of being really captivated was working in archives. It was going into archives and looking at the actual documents, the letters that people were writing to one another, the sort of the remaining physical written legacy. I'm a huge lover of libraries and archives.
Actually, because there's something it's so wonderful. Clap properly then. I hate VD clapping. So actually, that feeling of a library, when you're in the middle of a library, and which is why the Ooty Literary Festival is so dear to me, is that you have kind of compressed humanity in those books, in those letters, because there's some sweat, there's some tears, there's some ink, there's some blood, there's some food, there's everything, in an archive. And it's like a compendium of humanity, which also could, when you're looking at, say, something like Sir Francis Young Husband, you're actually looking at somebody who's traversed so many different terrains, and at that time, to be able to confront what later became Shangri-La, in the Western imagination. How did you bring your Patrick Frenchness to his Sir Francis Young Husbandness? Yeah.
Well, to an extent, I did show the workings of the research in the biography itself. But just to give context, Young Husband was born in I've almost forgotten now. I think it was 1853. Is that right? 1863, and died in 1942. And he was a spy, he was an explorer, he was a colonial figure who led the British or British Indian invasion of Tibet in 1903. But the interesting thing about him, historically, biographically, is the fact that he then turned most of his opinions, most of his views on their head. He became a proponent of Indian nationalism in the 1930s. He tried to start a new religion based on the ideas that there were extraterrestrial beings on a planet called Altair who sent cosmic vibrations down to Earth. And he even, in the last years of his life, during the Blitz, beginning of World War II, thought he could become the father of what he called the Godchild, or the new Messiah. And he persuaded his lover, his girlfriend, Madeleine Lees, that they might produce the Godchild. And when I found that, again, it's the archives, it was actually in Madeleine's daughter's house in the attic. When I found these letters, I remember thinking, what if actually a baby was born, and what if the Godchild is out there, and I'm going to be able to say, the Messiah, you are the Messiah. So it would be like, a kind of Monty Python moment. But anyway, there was no child born. But what was extraordinary about that archive, actually, was that when Madeleine's daughter brought the letters to me, her dog leapt up and took a mouthful of letters and ran off around the garden chewing these letters. And I was, at that time, very heavily influenced by Buddhism, and I thought, I can't do anything cruel to the dog, but then I thought the letters come first. So I sort of strangulated the dog and got the letters back,
I love that. Actually, Francis Young Husband, if he was born today, he would have been like a noted figure. He would have had an ashram up in the hills, and thousands of young people would have been willing to be the young wife to the young husband. Yeah. Anyway, so actually, I wonder, that book has never, it's not got an Indian edition, has it?
I think the current edition is a UK Penguin paperback, which is imported into India.
Oh.
But that's effectively an Indian edition in practice, yeah.
I suppose, yeah. And so from Young Husband to Sir Lord Vidya Naipaul. My favorite moment was calling up for an interview, and Mrs. Naipaul picked up the phone. So she said, I said, is that Mrs. Naipaul? So she said, Lady Naipaul, if you please. So I said, no, I don't please Mrs. Naipaul.
Did you say this is Lord Pinto?
Yeah, I should have. I should have said Baron Pinto.
But anyway, I didn't get the interview either.
And of course, one sort of like, I felt when Vidya Naipaul went, I thought a mountain had fallen, but the light was much clearer now. The light was streaming in more clearly. It must have been very interesting to deal with such a talented and tragically flawed figure like Naipaul, no?
There's actually a story which I think I was told by the journalist Veer Sanghvi about Naipaul coming in the late 1980s to Calcutta. And I can't remember if it was Veer or himself or a journalist he worked with getting a call from Naipaul and wanting to meet this person, I think with a view to learning more about some aspect of Bengali society. And the person who picked up the call assumed that it was a hoax and kept on going, yeah, V.S. Naipaul, I'm sure you're V.S. Naipaul. And he was going, no, but I am V.S. Naipaul. And in the end he said, if you don't believe me, ring the Taj where I'm staying and ask for V.S. Naipaul. And so the journalist goes, fine, calls back, gets put through to a pastry chef by the name of Nagpal. 2 weeks later, he learns V.S. Naipaul has exited Calcutta. And he's never met him. So, the nature of writing the life, or as honestly as you can of a living person is extremely difficult. And I think the remarkable thing about V.S. Naipaul was that he opened up all of his archives. He spoke to me very frankly, as did people who knew him. And he didn't in any way seek to constrain what I wrote in the biography. So in other words, his own bad behavior, his cruel behavior, his unkindness to people, instead of doing what most of us do, which is to try to hide it away and pretend it never happened, he was open and he was direct. So I think some of the, if you like, the very negative features of his character, it's not that they were uniquely bad, it's more that he was uniquely open about them. And I do feel, it was a real shock actually when he passed away last month, because although I knew he was not very well, he was such an epic figure. I mean, he was such a huge figure within post-colonial literature, and actually within people's ideas of what sort of society we live in. He was somebody who a lot of people fought against and argued against, but the fact that his position on many things was so clearly defined gave people something to grate against.
So when you decided to write India a portrait, were you taking a Naipaulian position, or were you define a position against which people could argue?
Not really, because India a portrait is made up of, it's partly history, but a lot of it is anecdotal personal narratives where an individual person will talk about being enslaved in a quarry in Karnataka for 19 months, or they might talk about how they got in early on the cell phone revolution and made billions out of it. So in a way what I was doing in that book was taking significant events in India post-economic liberalization, post the early 90s, tracking back to particularly the 1940s and saying what were the roots of these changes that happened, but then saying, well, if many people are becoming richer, if you've got an annual growth rate of 8-9% compounded over a couple of, a decade or more, what is the transformative social effect? What does it do when, for example, a 25-year-old daughter-in-law in a household earns 3 times as much as the father, the patriarch in that house? What is the effect? What is the social disruption? So it was almost like a process of trying to find people who would explain or illustrate a lot of things that are happening in India right now.
So in that sense, the role of the historian there becomes the person who chooses the inflection points. What was the process by which you chose your inflection points?
So the advantage with India a Portrait was that I wrote it, I began writing it in 2008, but I'd already been thinking about it for about 5 or 10 years, so I knew what I wanted to write about. I was familiar enough with the surrounding intellectual or academic or historical argument. So I'd done the groundwork, and it was then a question of, interviewing or meeting 3, 4, 5 people and deciding which of them was actually going to make the story, because I'm sure many people who are here in the audience who write will have had that experience where somebody has an extraordinary story to tell, but for one reason or another they don't tell it to you. Yeah. And it's a very personal. It's each individual's psychology, whether or not they can actually remember and narrate the bits that you, as the listener, want to hear.
And that seems to be also the problem, I think, with the way people tell stories. They tell stories as adjectives. He was very nice, but they won't tell you why he was nice, or illustrate how he was
exactly.
nice.
Or they say something that they've read in a newspaper article about that person. And I'm thinking, you met that person in 1975. I want to know what you thought of them. And instead, they repeat what they've read elsewhere.
Received wisdom, I think. So is that the position of a historian necessarily needs to be outside the tradition in order to be able to look at it? Or is there some strength to be gained from the fact that you've lived in India for like yonks now? Yonks is a very useful historical term.
Eons, yeah. No, I've been in and out of India since the 1980s, but I've only lived here permanently or full-time since for 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is the position outside better, or not better, but what are the strengths of being inside and what are the strengths of being outside?
So I think that if you're looking at sort of complex areas of history, particularly about 1900, that being inside can be extremely helpful, particularly with language sources, being able to know. It's quite possible, of course, to come from outside and to learn your way into a series of languages, but often people within certain cultural traditions, certain linguistic traditions, are the ones who get the real inside story. But having said that, you obviously need the training as a historian so that you can, to an extent, keep a distance and analyze the material and not simply go down the hagiographical route, which in most historical traditions is how you write, particularly about individual people. The biographical tradition in most cultures is hagiography, which is not what the historian should be doing.
Are you being polite and not saying South Asian traditions, or are you?
No, well, it's true. It is a South Asian tradition, but it's also a Russian tradition. It was a British tradition up until about 1921, I guess, when Lytton Strachey started to write. And actually, I think that Lytton Strachey has been over-influential in being sort of ironic and cynical, which in itself is another trap.
At this moment, it seems as if every single discipline is up for rewriting in terms of other narratives. We've recently had a kerfuffle over donkeys' urine and planes flying. History especially has a lot of grabbers right now. Everybody wants to own the tradition and wants to rewrite the tradition. It must be particularly. Do you find yourself in a contentious space?
In a way, academic disciplines and traditions are being rewritten in positive ways as well as in the negative way you're describing, in that increasingly people realize the importance of interdisciplinary study, the need, particularly, for example, in the social sciences, to reconfigure what sociology and anthropology are and how they fit together, to have certain kinds of methodological training in order to write interestingly about politics, about political science. Again, in the case of history, the importance of literature. In the case of psychology, increasingly, you're needing to bring in biology, you're needing to bring in neuroscience. We now know that we are, to a far greater extent than people realized even 10, 15 years ago, we are genetically programmed to behave in certain ways. You only have to look at twin studies, twins who are separated soon after birth, and you realize that there are all sorts of things that we do, the way that we sit, what we like to eat, what we like to wear, whether or not we put pens in our top pockets, I mean, these things are actually genetically programmed to the extent that twins separated at the age of 4, who meet again at the age of 45, often are dressed virtually identically. They might sort of cough or laugh in a very similar way. They might have nearly identical taste in food. So all that thing of thinking, it is me, well, it isn't only you, it's your neuroscience, it's the biochemistry in your body. So I'm deviating slightly, but my point is that I think every academic discipline needs to be rethought and needs to be interrogated right now. I think that a lot of the attempts to, if you like, decolonize the curriculum that you see within universities around the world actually also need to be done in India. You can't simply say, well, here is a template, here is a structure within social science or within the humanities that in almost every case was formed in the 19th century in Central Europe or Western Europe, that it can be easily transferred